Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Here I am again, Menopause Taylor, giving you another radio tutorial on menopause and really the state of menopause in the world today. And not everything I talk about is about menopause specifically, but I always address a matter that might affect your menopause. And I like to give you some practical information that is just useful no matter what your circumstance and really regardless of whether you're male or female. And so, we live in a world in which we hear so many tidbits about so many things. And many of you assume that you need to act in one way or another on everything. And sometimes you assume that every single thing will have an effect on your menopause. So I like to present some things about which you may have questions, and I like to explain their relevance or lack thereof to menopause. And recently, the last few broadcasts have been on dietary options for menopause. I've discussed soy, plant-based diet, dairy, and spices. And since nowadays you hear so much about gluten, I thought it would be useful to give you a tutorial on gluten and the significance of a gluten-free diet. So the name of this broadcast is Gluttons for the Gluten-Free Glut. So, have you ever wondered how people choose one diet over another? Or how they get to the point of restricting their diet to only certain kinds of foods? Do you think they change their diets suddenly or gradually? And in the case of gluten, what is it that leads someone to knowing that they're sensitive to gluten and that they need to avoid it? If you've ever heard anything about gluten, you should listen to this broadcast to understand exactly what it is. Because you see, most people hear about things, but they only get a sound bite or two. And beyond that, they really know nothing. And I don't want you doing what everyone else is doing or reacting impulsively to everything you hear. I want you to have real knowledge about some things. So I'm going to educate you about gluten. And I really love starting with definitions. So let's start with the definition of gluten. Gluten, spelled Gluten, is a group of proteins found in certain grains, most significantly wheat, spelt, barley, and rye. So right there, gluten is a protein. So you see that gluten is something that is entirely natural. So you might be wondering, well, if gluten is natural, why would you need to avoid it? And have you ever wondered how gluten got its name? Well, you know how you get a sticky kind of glue-like dough when you mix flour with water? It's kind of stretchy, and that gluey, stretchy characteristic makes the dough like elastic. And that elasticity is what gives bread its ability to rise when you bake it. And it also gives it that chewy texture that most people associate with bread and which most people love. So gluten gets its name from that gluey property. Just think of glue. Now that brings us to the term gluten sensitivity. Gluten sensitivity is when you have difficulty digesting that gluey protein called gluten. Now, a few broadcasts ago, I talked about dairy, and I taught you that your body stops producing the enzyme lactase to digest the sugar lactose in milk. So you might wonder if the same thing happens with the inability to digest gluten. Do you think it's a normal thing to be unable to digest gluten like it is with dairy? Do you think we're supposed to lose our ability to digest gluten? Well, no. The two are entirely, absolutely, completely different. You are supposed to be able to digest gluten your entire life. But some people can't break down the gluten completely. And the fact is that you really don't digest a whole lot of what you eat. For instance, you don't digest the fiber in plants, but you do extract the nutrients from them. The difference with gluten intolerance is that the inability to digest parts of the gluten causes an autoimmune response. In other words, people who have gluten intolerance are simply allergic to it. It's a lot like the case with peanuts. Most people can eat peanuts just fine, but some people are allergic to them. And those who are allergic to them have an allergic reaction if they eat them. Now, the majority of people with gluten sensitivity have celiac disease. Celiac spelled C-E-L-I-A-C. And celiac disease is a genetic mutation. Now, for those people, gluten is a foreign invader, and it actually makes them ill. But other people have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And for them, the difficulty digesting gluten is not due to a genetic mutation, but they still react negatively to the gluten. So how do you know if you have gluten intolerance or gluten sensitivity or celiac disease? Well, as with any situation in which your body dislikes something or can't digest a food, you end up having a list of symptoms after eating the offending food. With gluten intolerance, the possible symptoms include abdominal pain, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, pale colored feces, or stinky bowel movements. But those are only the symptoms directly related to your digestive tract. There are others that aren't as obvious as being due to gluten intolerance, and those include anemia, muscle pain, arm or leg numbness, and weight loss. And there's a whole list of gluten insensitivity symptoms that are the same as some of the symptoms of menopause. And those are headaches, fatigue, skin rash, depression, anxiety, joint pain, muscle pain, and brain fog. So think about this. Let's say you have a list of symptoms of menopause, some of which are the same symptoms as gluten intolerance. And then there are the symptoms of lactose intolerance that overlap with some of the same symptoms of gluten intolerance. So how in the world are you supposed to distinguish all these things? Well, I have news for you. This is how everything is in medicine. For every disease, there are multiple other diseases that can cause some of the same symptoms. Medical school is all about learning how to rule out what isn't causing your symptoms and zero in on what is. So this is why you can't use the internet to diagnose yourself. I mean, think about it. Why would anyone go through 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and 4 years of residency training at the very minimum if they could learn everything they need to know on the internet? Well, the answer is they wouldn't. And you can't diagnose yourself with what you find on the internet either. So the tests that determine whether or not you have gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance are blood tests for autoimmune diseases and a biopsy of your small intestine. But there has been a glut of gluten-free eating recently, and most of the people omitting gluten from their diets have not had a formal diagnosis of gluten intolerance or gluten sensitivity or celiac disease. Instead, most of them have simply omitted gluten from their diets, felt a little better, and labeled themselves as gluten intolerant. So does that mean that gluten is bad and that we should all avoid it? Well, here's how common gluten issues are. 1 person in 100 has celiac disease. 1 person in 1,000 has gluten intolerance. So this means that 98% of people have no difficulty at all with gluten. And for them, products that contain gluten are beneficial. Just because some people have a peanut allergy doesn't mean that no one should eat peanuts, and the same is true with gluten. And if you do decide to get diagnostic testing for celiac disease, if you've already been on a gluten-free diet, you're going to miss the diagnosis altogether. And since it's a genetic mutation, you really need to know if you truly have celiac disease. So be really careful with deciding that you're gluten intolerant and going on a gluten intolerant type of diet before getting a diagnosis. That's backward. That's upside down. Here's another fact. Most people who are supposedly on a gluten-free diet aren't actually on gluten-free diets. They actually eat gluten inadvertently. Some of the foods that are labeled gluten-free are contaminated with gluten like crazy. You know, I always like to look at the history of problems. And if you consider the fact that humans have been eating gluten-containing grains for 12,000 years, it makes you wonder why people are suddenly such gluttons for the gluten-free glut. There has been a 400% increase in celiac disease in just the last 40 years. So what's going on? Well, here are some of the reasons for the glut. Modern wheat and grain, all the other grains, for that matter, are hugely manipulated. And then the manipulated wheat is processed. You see, this is new. Wheat and other grains were not always manipulated and processed. And not only are they hugely manipulated and processed, but we also eat way too many comfort foods, all of which are full of gluten. And we don't eat enough plants. And the so-called gluten-free foods are even more processed than the original grains that actually contain the gluten. So what you have here is a situation where people who are trying to avoid something are eating foods that are more manipulated and more processed. And if you add all that to the fact that most people who have difficulty digesting gluten have difficulty digesting a whole lot of other foods. So ironically, the more people have digestive difficulty, the more they limit their consumption to bland carbohydrates, some of which cause the gluten problem in the first place. You see, it's like this vicious cycle. So different digestive problems occur for different reasons. Lactose intolerance from dairy products occurs because you are supposed to outgrow your ability to digest dairy products. Mother Nature never intended for you to consume them beyond the time when you were weaned from breast milk. And gluten-containing grains are good for the vast majority of people, but all the manipulation and processing and overindulgence of heavy gluten-containing carbohydrates are overkill. So, if you have digestive difficulties of any kind, here's what I suggest you try. First, for 2 weeks, eliminate all dairy products. Absolutely nothing with a mother, which means no eggs, no milk, no cheese, no yogurt, no butter, no cream, nothing that comes from the dairy products. 85% of people who do that discover that dairy